It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked on Cowboys. Locked on Cowboys.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you for tuning in. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. And joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can check him out on Twitter at McCoolBCB. You can also listen to him on the Best Coast Boys podcast. And we have a special guest for you guys, Matt Williamson at Williamson NFL, former NFL scout, writer at Pro Football Network, also the host of the Locked On Dynasty Football podcast. Matt, what is going on, sir?
Not a lot, man. This is going to be fun. How are you guys?
Doing well. This is awesome for me because when I was in college, Matt, I used to listen to your podcast when you were on ESPN. So to have you as a guest on our show is pretty freaking cool. So I'm really excited to get into it.
I'll just chime in. Before you even knew what podcasts were. I mean, that was one of the first NFL podcasts ever back in the ESPN days.
That's what I was going to say is that podcast actually inspired me to get into podcasting in the first place. So, I was a big fan way back then. And that was even before I decided to do sports podcasting. So, thanks for joining us. It's a real honor on this side for sure.
Yeah, I remember walking to class in one of the off seasons. Matt, you talked about teams signing Nnamdi Asomugha all off season long because every team wanted to sign Nnamdi. I think that's one of the off seasons I remember the most. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
Real quick, just to tell you how long ago that was. It makes me feel old, but thank you guys, by the way. When we hired Ross Tucker and I hosted for a while, ESPN called Ross and asked him, hey, do you want to host this podcast with Matt Williamson? He's like, oh, Matt does great work, but what's a podcast? And meanwhile, Ross has like this huge podcast network now. So times have changed.
Exactly. Wow.
All right, Matt, let's talk about the Dallas Cowboys because we're always a little bit jaded. We cover this team every single day. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts from an outsider perspective. How do you think about this Cowboys team? What do you think about this Cowboys team entering 2021?
Well, if we go back to 2019, the Cowboys had the best offense in the league, in my opinion. That's when Mahomes was, on fire, and there were so many great teams out there, offenses out there. But on a yards per play basis, which is one of my favorite metrics over the course of the year, Dallas was number one in 2019. And with Dak last year, as everyone knows, it wasn't much different. The wins were there. But boy, I mean, everyone blames the Dak injury for the downfall of the team. But boy, the offensive line was so injured. I think this is really set up to be one of the absolute best offenses in the league yet again. I think Dak could even be in the MVP conversation. And, they're loaded on that side of the ball. The defense gives me a lot of pause without question, and I don't think I'm unique in saying that. But what I like about it when you analyze last year's defense is they can't make more mental errors. It was those things have to come back to the mean. I mean, I think they're going to simplify the defense a little bit. There's a new coordinator. And one of my favorite things that they did this offseason is I really praise teams after the draft that made a lot of picks, especially on one side of the ball. I mean, so they have a lot. They're young, but there's a lot of players that maybe aren't household names yet or haven't even dressed in the NFL that should be able to contribute.
Matt, you mentioned the how good the offense was last year in the previous 2 years, and then obviously before Dak got hurt. Yeah, it did seem like even before Dak got hurt, there was some problems with fumbling and some issues with getting a little bit of efficiency in the offense early before they could kind of get things going. But did you notice any? And this is a very small sample size, so it's difficult. I'm interested to see if you noticed any Mike McCarthy specific influence on a Kellen Moore offense last year in the kind of limited exposure we got with, a full Cowboys offense?
Well, I don't think going back to the Jason Garrett years, first of all, I think it was an upgrade from there schematically. I think it's pretty difficult to really wrap your head around it because I'm not making excuses or avoiding your question, but when you had this time last year, they weren't doing mini camps. There was a very, very abbreviated training camp. no preseason whatsoever. To install a new offense, I think a lot of these teams that had new coordinators last year weren't able to really show all their cards. It's just too hard to get it in and to trust it more than that. I mean, yeah, you can write it on paper and say, learn this, but to actually call things and lean on schemes that they want to try, I think is to be determined. And I think we might be a little bit shocked by maybe it took a year for a lot of these teams that have new people in charge of play calling and schemes. I was not a big McCarthy fan schematically in Green Bay, to be honest with you. Pretty generic, and I do look at this team on both sides of the ball and worry about being a little predictable. The kind of everyone knows what they're going to be up to, and coaches are too good for that. If they know what defense you're going to play or what your tendencies are, you're probably just not going to out-talent people. But the more influence is really interesting to me. And again, I'm not avoiding the conversation from last year, but I hope he has a lot of input.
Matt, let's talk about Dak, because I think we saw the value of Dak last year after he got hurt, which is a strange way to value a quarterback. But how do you look at Dak going into the 2021 season? Do you think he's closer to a top 5 quarterback than a top 10 quarterback? You mentioned he has MVP upside. What are just your general thoughts about Dak?
Rookie year, I mean, if we really want to do the history of Dak through Matt Williamson's eyes, I thought rookie year he was a little overrated because the line was really humming then. Zeke came on the scene with him and just tore things up. And people talked about Dak like he was a phenom, like he was the next Tom Brady in the late rounds. And I thought he was a really good player and a starter at that point, obviously, but I thought perception was a little too strong on him bursting on the scenes. I thought he still had a lot of things to work through. Since then, I kind of think he's been criminally underrated because when he showed up, I thought he was kind of a function of the offense, fell into a great landing spot. It takes a village to raise a quarterback. But since then, I think he's been the catalyst of the offense rather than the other way around. That he's been the driving force. When there's Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks have their trucks and trailer analogy. And I look at more of it like a train, like Aaron Rodgers is the steam engine and just pulls everyone behind him. Well, Dak's closer to that now than what he was. Yeah. And I mean, he's much more accurate than given credit for. We know the athleticism, but he doesn't need to lean on it. Tough as the day is long too. I mean, I don't know if that gets talked about with him too, but he's a bulldog and those guys follow him.
All right, I think we've talked enough about the positive side of this. We have to get to the defensive side of the ball, unfortunately, and discuss that as well. The Cowboys obviously in the offseason changed defensive coordinators from Mike Nolan to Quinn. And I do think that kind of going back to what you were saying, Nolan, whether he had a solid plan coming into the situation or not, it even got further obliterated by the COVID offseason and the no opportunity for mini camps and training camps at OTAs. Having said all that, how much, looking back at this personnel, where it was before Nolan and some of those guys coming in, and then, keeping in mind the new folks that were brought in by Quinn, how much do you think this defense can improve? And you can quantify it however you like. How much do you think that they can improve just by simply being all on the same page and at least not being confused on their run fits and first down and just kind of simple, defense 101 stuff?
I don't know if you guys agree with me, but I expect this to be a lot of the Seattle cover 3 principles. Do you think that's fair? I mean,
yes.
Yeah, certainly like defensive back wise. Yeah.
Right. So they're obviously, after corners with super long arms and certain dimensions and, linebackers that can run and play every down, Bobby Wagner, those type of guys probably generate a lot of pass rush with your front 4, Lawrence being the catalyst there. But I bring up the scheme first and foremost because in a way, I mentioned at the start of the show, because you're bringing in so many rookies, I don't know how many defensive rookies they brought in off the top of my head, but a lot. Obviously. A lot.
Yeah.
I think
defense is worth, basically.
Yeah, right. I mean, a lot of guys that can play snaps, even in a rotation or, in Parsons' case, probably as a linebacker / edge rusher. I do expect him to rush off the edge a lot. Having a simplified defense to me should make that much easier transition for the rookies. And even the incumbents, I would expect a lot less errors. I just don't think it has a high ceiling for this year. But as good as the offense is, I think league average defense is what you're striving for. If you could be middle of the road, this is probably the best team in the division and a contender in the NFC. I'm kind of just looking for the defense not to stink, and in a way, I think the scheme will help that because the roles are pretty simplified. But I also think that scheme has been figured out a lot in the NFL too. I mean, hiring a Seattle cover 3 type of coach, I think limits you because the Sean Paytons of the world and all the smart offensive minds have figured that out and know how to attack it. But for now, I think it's a good transition for all the youth.
All right, Matt, you mentioned the draft. We had kind of mixed feelings on this draft class. What were your thoughts on what the Cowboys did specifically in the first 2 days?
I'm sure, like everybody, you guys would have much rather ended up with Horn or Surtain. Everyone in the world mocked to the Cowboys, and it didn't work that way. Yes, I 100% agree. After signing Keanu Neal and already having Van Der Esch and Jalen Smith, Parsons seemed a little redundant, but you didn't pick up Van Der Esch's 5th-year option. I think him and Smith might not be long for the Cowboys. And I mentioned it before with Parsons. Even if he were just an edge rusher, if he was battling Kwity Paye and Jason Owe and all those type of guys, I think he still is a first-round player. So if they use him in that capacity, especially on third and long situations, I think he'll have a lot of impact, high upside. I don't love the names. I keep mentioning they drafted a lot of players, but I don't necessarily love the players they drafted. You throw Jabril Cox in that mix too. I was a little shocked he fell as much as he did. I do like that pick a lot, but again, a little redundant in the middle of the field. He's a real similar to a Neal or a guy like that. But I will say one thing about this organization that I'm sure you guys recognize, but I don't think the national audience does. The Jones family or whoever's doing the scouting or has the final say, they draft very, very well. Their track record with drafts is much better than they're given credit for.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the better front offices in the league. But the problem they get into is when somebody, when they give the pick to a coach, right? That's when they get into trouble a little bit. And it seems like we saw that a little bit in this draft. Whether it's Nashawn Wright in the 3rd round, a corner from Oregon State, who most people didn't have with the draftable grade. So that's where they get in trouble. But I do agree that they're not a bad drafting team at all. They have a couple picks here and there that are a little bit questionable.
I think some traits with those guys as opposed to total package or Yes.
Matt, how do you think this team stacks up just compared to the rest of the teams in the NFC East? Because I keep coming back to this. They're maybe not the most well-rounded team, but when you have a quarterback, it just puts you so much further ahead than everybody else in the division. How do you think they stack up compared to everybody else?
I think that's well said. I mean, clearly the best quarterback, and I don't even think it's close. I think Washington and Dallas are the teams really competing for the top spot. I don't have a lot of faith in Daniel Jones, and I see what they did there. And Philly did the same thing. Miami did the same thing. Young quarterback with questions. We're going to surround him with all kinds of weapons. And, oh, by the way, we're going to have an extra first-round pick or 2 in our back pocket in case that quarterback doesn't work out for next year. I mean, there's 4 or 5 teams that really had that model to some degree, even including Jacksonville and the Jets and, some of these teams with young quarterbacks. But the Giants didn't address their line. I don't think Jones' pocket presence works well behind a suspect line, and I think he's a turnover machine. So I think he holds that team back, but I like the rest of their team, defense, weapons. I just think Philly's in a total rebuild, and I'm not a Jalen Hurts believer. I think they'll end up with 3 first-round picks next year, and Hurts will not be the starter a year from now if we have this conversation. So it's worth a shot, see what he can do, but I think they're building an infrastructure for their next quarterback. Which brings me to Washington. I like this team a lot. Mm-hmm. However, their quarterback play was so bad last year. With respect to Alex Smith, he's a wonderful story. He made me scared for his life every time he walked on the field. And he was just such a check down. I mean, dumping it to J.D. McKissick over and over and over, and Haskins was in over his head. So Fitzpatrick's going to be better and more aggressive and harder to play against. But my thing with Fitzpatrick is I think people, and a lot of it's fantasy driven probably, wow, the Washington's going to be so much better. Their offense is going to be high flying. This guy's been a backup for 18 years or whatever. All of a sudden, he's not going to be a new player. He's still going to be a turnover machine.
There's a reason he keeps getting replaced, right?
He keeps getting replaced for a reason. We know what he is, and he's the 28th best quarterback in the league, which is better than what they played with last year. But I just think that's the big problem in Washington. In the end, I think they're going to have to play close games, and their defense, especially their defensive line, should allow them to do it. But I think he's going to blow more games than he wins.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think that's the kind of high volatility with Fitzpatrick is not exactly the quarterback is not exactly a position you want high volatility.
No,
it feels like he is certainly that guy. So I guess let's pull back even further. It feels like you mentioned it that Washington and Dallas are probably the two teams to beat in the NFC East, and the Cowboys quarterback situation maybe gives them a little bit of a head advantage over Washington in the NFC East. Let's talk about the formula overall, the kind of high-scoring defense doing what they can to limit points while winning 45-35 or whatever those kind of games that Cowboys are looking to get into. What's the ceiling for that kind of formula? Can that kind of formula? And I think that's the question we get from a lot of Cowboys fans is, you're right. Everybody knows what this is. The Cowboys are going to go into the season, try to score a whole bunch of points and limit you guys to as scoring as few as possible and just slowing you down. What does that kind of formula have a ceiling that can actually get them to a Super Bowl, or is that kind of a glass ceiling that they won't be able to get past until their defense gets at least above average or in top 10 area?
It's a big question. I mean, it's obviously a philosophical question for today's NFL. And I think Cowboys fans really should be happy with any opposing drive that ends with a kick. As long as it's not 6, as long as it's not 7, I'll take a field goal time and time again. I think this formula is better than the opposite, though. I mean, I think winning games 13-10 with defense and grinding it out is much harder than the other way around in today's NFL. I mean, because in those games, one bad bounce, one blocked field goal, something out of your control even, you look back and say, how did we lose that game? We played the exact style we wanted. Where Dallas, a lot of them are just going to be, last possession wins. Or, well, boy, that was a bad series. We'll trot the stud offense back out there, and we're still in it. You're still have a puncher's chance. Where if you don't have the quarterback and you have to play really low-scoring games, the NFL rules are just too hard on you. So, can they win the Super Bowl? Can they be the best team in the league with this defense? You lean towards no. Winning games 40-38 week after week. I mean, you're going to have some variance there where you don't get the roll at the end, or you don't get the ball last, and you better be good with your clock management and all those type of things. But the best parts are in place, and the defense, I think, at least has some hope now. I think there's a little more light at the end of that tunnel.
All right, Matt, we're going to get you out on this one. I have to pick on you a little bit before you go. So You just did your top 25 wide receiver rankings at Pro Football Network. And our guy, Amari Cooper, at number 19. Come on, man. You got to defend that one a little bit. How did he not make the top 15?
That's rough. I'm going to get on your good graces first. First of all, I think CeeDee Lamb's going to be 10th next year. I think
that was my next question. I'm glad that you answered that. Yeah.
I love CeeDee Lamb. I think he's going to – we just did a fantasy draft on Peacock and Williamson, and CeeDee Lamb, we took him ahead of Amari Cooper. I think he's going to lead the team in receptions. I think he's a star in the making. And part of it's because Cooper's a little up and down. And trust me, a player with his resume and what he does week after week, at any other position probably would have been 10th on my list. If he's a running back, it's just there's so many receivers. The difference between him being 19th and my 12th receiver is minimal. I mean, it really is. I just don't trust him a lot. I think there's a little bit of variance there. I think there's just a little too much roller coaster to say he isn't, in those top dozen or so. So, I mean, we're splitting hairs at that position. There's so much talent in the league, but I really like Lamb.
That's a very political answer. I appreciate
Well done.
that.
Well done.
You guys can check out Matt's top 25 wide receiver rankings on Pro Football Network. I also saw his running back rankings were over there.
Yeah.
Make sure you see where Ezekiel Elliott's at. I think listeners will be happy about that one. Yeah.
Your physique on the rankings.
Yep. Tight end rankings are out there. You can follow Matt at Williamson NFL. Make sure you check out all the great work that he's doing, especially over there at Locked On Dynasty. I know those guys they do a good job over there.
Good group over there.
Yeah, good group. Matt, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was fun, guys. Take care.
That is it for today's show. Thank you guys for tuning in. As always, you can download, subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audacity, wherever you get your podcast. Again, follow Matt at Williamson NFL. You can follow Landon at McCool BCB. I'm at Marcus _